Before that, we will listen to, let me introduce you, Mirna Safi, who is associate professor and head of the Observatoire du changement social, sociologique du changement, pardon. She's also a fellow at the CIMigration, and she's working on immigration, ethnic and racial inequalities and discrimination more broadly, and segregation as well. And she recently was involved in a project talking about the impact of COVID in social life. So that's another interesting specialty, which is not related to what she will say. She has published recently in 2020 Migration and Inequality at Polity Press, and I have the book so I can show the cover. And so, among other publications that I will not quote as well. And Mirna, I have our title, so this time we'll speak about migration and ethnoracial recategorization, which is not very far from what Thomas has just presented. So, Mirna, your own.
Yes, thanks very much, Patrick. Hello, everybody. I want just to start by thanking Patrick and Solène and all the organizers for the presentation. And thanks very much to Thomas also for a thoughtful presentation. And indeed, actually, we haven't discussed before, but we have some overlapping, I think, parts in our presentation, as you will notice, especially at the beginning of mine. But if you wait a bit, you'll see that I'll maybe add some kind of European and French perspective to some of Thomas' thoughts on immigration, assimilation, and race. So let me just start by presenting a little bit how I will organize this presentation. First, I want to start with a really brief discussion on migration and the paradigm of assimilation. And I will move actually to the core, theoretical, let's say, insight that I will try to review on migration and ethnoracial reconfiguration before moving to some empirical examples. I will draw mainly on my work, especially some work in progress on France in particular. So first, some discussion about migration and assimilation. I just want to highlight, and it's something that maybe all migration scholars know, that really the concept of assimilation is impressively successful. It's noticeable that this is a concept that really was exported across national settings, but also disciplinary boundaries and theoretical strands. Everybody in migration studies uses this concept. It's striking to notice that even economists, for instance, use this concept. And somehow it's of course there's some kind of difference between the US and Europe and France, but I argue in my work that these differences are mainly terminological. We can explain a little bit why, but actually in Europe and in France, we have this kind of preference for the term integration, although actually both concepts are used in quite interchangeable way in terms of the conceptualization. And so the concept, of course, has been transformed actually all through the 20th century, thanks to the work of a lot of sociologists, including, of course, Thomas, who's also contributing to this very rich literature. But maybe something interesting is that we tend to think about the concept today as very much as an American concept, but actually it has been somehow imported to the United States, or at least the Chicago School work on assimilation has been very much influenced by the pioneer sociologist work, not on migration really precisely, but on the term of integration and how can we make a society and what is integration in a society. So these kind of functionalist approaches are, in my opinion, actually at the origin of the concept. And it's really striking because I never, in a sense, I think I've never submitted a paper to a journal without getting some kind of feedback about me not discussing sufficiently with the assimilation framework. So just really, my point here is just to tell you that this is a dominant framework. We are expected to discuss with this literature, although the literature changed a lot. The perspective on assimilation changed a lot. It started really with this idea that assimilation is mostly about culture convergence, and I'll come to this maybe in a few minutes. And then we had this kind of social stratification insights, presenting the concept as much more linked to social mobility. And finally, as mentioned by Thomas, mainly also because thanks to the contribution of Albany and other scholars in the US, we move towards more connection between assimilation and ethno-racial perspective, and today it's actually something that we can observe. Of course, the concept of boundary work is very much used within, let's say, the assimilation literature. Something maybe a little bit striking is that the concept, although the concept itself has some kind of a universal, you could say, because of the natural, let's say, connotation of the concept, it has some kind of universal, powerful representation of the reality. Today's usage of the concept stresses very much its complication, heterogeneity across different groups, including also the use of the idea of racialized assimilation. So we are still very much using the concept despite really change in its understanding. So now I just want to try to think a little bit about the consequences of these let's say connections between migration and ethno-racial dynamics within the assimilation framework. I think they are sometimes under theorized by some by social scientists, because they somehow rely or at least start with this idea that migration is contributing, let's say, to cultural heterogeneity, for better or worse somehow, because some will actually use the term diversity and some others will use the term fragmentation in societies. But the idea here is that migration somehow incorporates some new raw materials somehow in the society, with implications in terms of trust, social cohesion, social capital. And these ideas have been actually challenged by scholars and the social scientists. For instance, I can just very briefly present some the work of Desmet that used actually the word value survey, drawing on data from 76 countries, that showed that actually if we measure culture by norms, values, beliefs, these questions that are very actually rich in the word value survey, we will see actually more heterogeneity within ethnic group and within countries than across countries. So these kind of ideas, of course, challenge the straightforward association between migration and increasing ethno-racial and cultural diversity. And of course, some other scholars, such as Brubaker and others, have also studied historical migration, where, on the contrary, actually, the effect was unmixing of population through migration in relation to nation state building and change in nation state borders, including in East Europe in particular. So these ideas have been challenged by the literature. On the other hand, we have also this association that is increasingly actually used in the European context of immigrants to racial minorities. Okay, and here again, it's something that is underlying actually this literature, but the point here is that, of course, in Europe, this is maybe more salient because we don't have very much words for race. So we tend to use immigrants increasingly also, let's say, as an euphemism to discuss issues about race. And we forget that actually immigrants are also, for instance, a lot of immigrants in Europe are European. Okay, so within Europe, within EU, migration is roughly speaking 40% of global population flows in Europe, and it's also the case in France and other countries. We have a substantial, share of immigration that is European. And more maybe fundamentally, it's somehow important to distinguish between immigration and racial minorities, because actually we have ambivalent relation with native racial minorities, and this is something that has been very much studied in the US. Of course, let's say in the US, immigrants historically tend to be depicted in antagonistic fashion toward the African American community, stressing the optimism, the hardworking, the success of immigrants in comparison to some native racial minorities. And these are things that we can find actually somehow in Europe. I won't develop too much because I don't want to be too long on the theoretical part. So my point just is, I tried to in my book that was mentioned very kindly by Patrick, to discuss. Actually, the book discusses the relation between migration and social inequality more precisely. But there's a chapter that I will draw on in this talk that really is interested in what I call the ethnoracial or the symbolic channel. And in the book, actually, I identify 3 channels through which migration can be seen as affecting social inequality: the economic, the legal, and the ethno-racial one. And so I maybe just very briefly here. So my point in the book is to say that migration has an effect, as really very similarly to what Thomas has just argued, can affect actually ethno-racial formation. And by ethno-racial formation, I refer to the process of meaning making, drawing on human differentiation markers, because actually migration triggered the circulation of a variety of markers, of course, but also more fundamentally, it provokes new situations of social encounters where actually the meaning of these markers can be actually reconstructed, renegotiated, etc. So the point here is that it doesn't mean that necessarily these migrants are different types of people, or that they really inject some kind of new raw material. It's not always the case. Sometimes they arrive with some kind of features, characteristics that are already meaningful in the host societies, and they manage somehow to affect the meaning-making dynamics of these categories. Okay, I give some examples in the books. I also highlight very much in the book the fact that these ethno-racial dynamics provoked by migration can be local and global, but maybe I won't expand too much on this because my examples don't really touch on this. But really the idea here is that I review the literature using other scholars' work to show that migration has the specificity of disseminating nationality-based markers, okay? Because actually markers come with actually different ethno-racial categories, and these are things that have been studied in the US also with the transnational migrants actually from and their effect on their origin country, migrants from Central America and Latin America in particular. But also because migrants actually encounter other migrants in the host countries, including migrants from different countries, but that share with them some kind of different characteristics than nationality. And then we can have these kind of dynamics that can lead actually to pan-ethnic affiliation or identification that may also somehow affect ethno-racial categorization. And this might have some effect globally on nationality-based categorization that are also interesting to incorporate into the effect of migration on ethno-racial dynamics. So just very briefly, I'll show you this table that summarizes somehow these dynamics. And because in the paper, I'm really interested on the effect also of ethno-racial dynamics on inequality, I try to disentangle what happens within nation states and what happens at the global level, and then also discuss, using really different examples from the literature, the outcome in terms of the solidification of existing ethno-racial inequality or possible destabilization effects. And I'll give you just very briefly some examples that also have been already mentioned by Thomas. Just my maybe in this talk I will really more precisely discuss how migrants are subject to existing racial category hierarchy, and how they actually mobilize their agencies to challenge and potentially reshape these ethno-racial hierarchy. And the literature has shown actually how they use a wide range of resources to do so, in the way they fit into existing ethno-racial categories. They resist to fitting down. They work toward whiteness. They act white. They mobilize work ethics, efforts, high aspiration, sometimes cultural, religious, phenotypical characteristics, and citizenship, as mentioned by Thomas. And this is something that I will come to in a few minutes. And also, it's really important to notice the cross-fertilization between different type of research, actually, historical, ethnographic, survey-based research, or administrative data, and again, as mentioned by Thomas, experimental design, to show actually all these complex dynamics that are provoked somehow by migration. I'll have some general examples here from the US, but maybe I won't go too much into the US examples. These are very dominant examples somehow in the literature. We can discuss this a little bit further if you want in the discussion. Of course, the US is a very interesting laboratory in a sense, because we have a very, we have some kind of intense immigration and racial dynamics. But we could argue that it's also the case somehow in Europe and in France in particular, but it's not only a matter of context, it's also a matter of research interest and also the related to the legitimacy of research on ethnic and racial issues in Europe and in France in particular. But here I'm just, using the classic work in the US, to which actually Thomas has contributed, trying to measure actually the effect of different migration on the ethno-racial categorization in the US. Maybe I can maybe expand a little bit more on some examples in Europe, and I'll come finally to France in particular. In Europe, there's also some ongoing work on the effect of the Eastern European migration on ethno-racial categorization somehow, or at least the rigidification of a European, non-European distinction, because we have also concomitant migration from Eastern Europe with ongoing migration from non-European countries. And we have also similar dynamic of distanciation of Eastern European migrants towards these non-European migrants, drawing on their belonging to the European Union increasingly. Of course, the Roma migrants is really an interesting case here, where we have the limitation of such a strategy because of course, intense discrimination and stigmatization that we could argue is actually imported from some origin countries. Maybe a few words about the French context. The French context, I argue in the book that the French context is also very rich for this type of literature, because we have also in France somehow the intersection of a history of colonialism, of also slavery and migration, including European and non-European migration. And also, maybe interestingly, in France, we have also this interesting native migration, okay, from overseas migrants that I tend, and others tend to also compare with current migrants and see how actually they identify and how they position themselves to other migrants, namely Black migrants, actually, because these overseas migration mostly, at least those who come from the Caribbean islands, are actually Black, and so how they position themselves also to African or migrants to France. Some work also has been done on return colonial migrants, and here it's really very similar to what Thomas has discussed about the the use of citizenship, and here mainly the whiteness that was somehow or the Frenchness that was somehow incorporated to colonial categories of citizenship, and how actually this helped these migrants, because these are also migrants who came actually mainly after in the post-colonial period to mainland France, but how actually this citizenship status that, let's say, fueled and eased their assimilation, facilitated their assimilation in mainland France. Okay, I'll stop here maybe just to be able, I don't remember exactly when I started, but let me maybe spend a few minutes giving you some examples based on using empirical work from some new recent French data. So first, I will maybe you know, everybody knows, I think, that we don't have in France ethnoracial classification similar to the ones that we can see in the United States or in other countries, including actually European countries. Okay, thank you. I will try to discuss these examples in 5 minutes. I will actually draw on two main examples, and maybe I'll be a little bit quick on the first one, because the second one maybe is more related to Thomas' also discussion. So this first example, we are using here data from Theo, which is a big survey that most of you, I guess, know in France. So we are using this question that is somehow a proxy of ethnoracial belonging. So because this question is actually asking individuals about the characteristics that define them the best, and among these characteristics, actually, we are focusing namely on 5 characteristics that we define as ethnoracial. And I'm showing you here, I don't know if you see well, that if we measure actually the belonging to, I mean, the identification with these characteristics across different groups that here are measured by objective place of birth, country of birth, egos, and parental country of birth, you will see that actually ethnoracial identification is higher for immigrants or migrants, more precisely, from the overseas, sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and less so, interestingly, for North African and Turkish. And you'll see actually that, of course, it's also less so for European migrants. So in the paper, we actually compare the effect of we are studying the effect of generation. Can we measure some kind of assimilation in the sense of intergenerational decline in ethnoracial identification? Because in the Theo survey, we can distinguish between first and second generation. And what you see here is that it's indeed the case, but this kind of intergenerational decline is only significant for European migration. It's not the case for non-European migration. We don't see really significant decline in ethnoracial categorization, identification, sorry, for these migrants. Okay, I'll stop here for this example, and here just it's a first example to show you that, of course, as far as we can use some kind of measures of ethnoracial identity, it seems that ethnoracial identity that differ across immigrant group, and also does not follow let's say homogeneous assimilation patterns across group. Now I want to spend a little bit more time, maybe the 3 minutes that remain, to discuss this paper that is using actually linked census data. And in this paper, we are working really on the change, on the shift in citizenship declaration. And mainly, it's really related to the fact that we've noticed this kind of empirically, by studying this data, that some people change over time their declaration of citizenship categories in a way that may appear, let's say, weird. For instance, some people will move to French by birth category, which is a category that should be actually somehow stable. People people can't actually move somehow from other categories such as foreigners or became French to French by birth. To be maybe clearer, I'll show you a little bit how the data is structured. So we have actually a declaration in the panel data. Over 40 years, even more, 50 years. So we can observe citizenship declaration at date T and then at date T+1, and if you want to look at these dynamics, normally French by birth, people that declared being French by birth in T should declare French by birth in T+1. Other type of transition, we call them declassification, in the sense that these people actually declare categories that are of lower status, in a sense, than the French by birth categories. And we are mostly interested in the paper, and namely in the other type of transition. So people who declared firstly that they became French, and these people actually normally they should actually also declare on subsequent censuses that they became French also. And we could see two different transitions, what we call reclassification. So these people actually declaring subsequently being French by birth, which is legally speaking impossible. And declassification, which is legally speaking possible, but very, very rare. And we have also these kind of transitions from foreigners who can actually, on subsequent censuses, declare becoming French because of naturalization, which is something possible, or remain foreigners, or again, switch to this kind of French by birth, the reclassification dynamics I was trying to present. So now, when you look at the data, what is striking is that, okay, you could tell me in these kind of these are linked census data, so they are really merged by the Institute of Statistics itself, and the matching rates is very important. You could tell me, okay, it's mostly because of noise. Actually, what you could we spend a lot of time in the article really arguing that this is not noise, and this is meaningful. And if you compare mainly, for instance, reclassification to declassification dynamic, you will notice that, for instance, declassification is rare. It's really could be understood as noise, while actually reclassification is something that happens not so rarely, about 10% between T and T+1 and 12% between T and T+2. And so we ask in the paper if these kind of citizen changes are driven by assimilation trajectories, or are they also capturing ethnoracial recategorization dynamics. I don't have a lot of time, but very quickly, what we show is that actually they show some kind of evidence that are related to both theoretical insight. For instance, people that are born in France or who naturalize or marry French nationals, they actually have higher chances of reclassification. And we try to understand, to really to show that this can be drawing on the panel structure of the data to really show this kind of subsequent life events that actually end up pushing people towards or increasing the probability towards switching to French by birth. And we also show that this reclassification is strongest among those born in some countries, namely non-European countries. And we also more precisely show an ex-colonial effect, really using a country-level variable that actually measure colonial relation with France. And we try to discuss also this effect. So I know I'm running out of time. The point here is that actually in a lot of studies on ethnoracial dynamics, citizenship has been understood mainly as, let's say, something that that migrants can use to fit up, but namely because of the, let's say, of the racialized feature of citizenship, as mentioned by Thomas at the turn of the century in the United States, and also in France, for instance, the return colonial example is also interesting in that regard. Our study also suggests that even migrants, even migrants that are not white somehow, can actually use citizenship in an instrumentalized way to reclassify in a way similarly to the literature on racial fluidity in the US. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop here. The talk was really aiming to discuss the importance of assimilation and ethnoracial reconfiguration, as to discuss the contribution of these theoretical insights and their relation to migrations. I want to stress the importance of dynamic perspective, and maybe something we can discuss more in depth in the Q&A section. Of course, this is also very important. This has implications in the ways in which we study actually migration and social inequality, and namely the issue of discrimination. Thank you very much, and sorry for being a little bit long.
Thank you, Mirna. Thank you so much. So I think your presentation speaks pretty well with the one of Thomas before.